ingredient of manufacturing. In the PLI schemes for white goods, we have covered a box item on the success of the air conditioners with respect to the PLI. The entire value chain for air conditioners manufacturing in the country is now in place. And particularly with respect to white goods, 43% of the new applicants in the scheme are micro, small, and medium enterprises. In terms of payment on time to micro businesses and small businesses, number of invoices financed on trades went up from 4.8 lakhs to 41.2 lakhs in FY24 the last 4 years. That is a nearly 8 times jump in the number of invoices financed through trades. And the amount financed on trades has also gone up from 11,000 crores to 1.4 lakh crores. And many of you are aware of the Section 43BH, which allows businesses to deduct payments only after they make the payment in the year in which they make the payment to micro, small, and medium enterprises, rather than on an accrual basis. And MSME cluster development program has improved productivity by 10 to 15%. And in this regard, the survey also covers many initiatives taken by different states, from Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh to Rajasthan to Tamil Nadu, etc. We cover initiatives taken by several states for the growing MSME businesses and attracting new businesses, which can serve as inspiration for other states as well. Harnessing the power of women entrepreneurs with respect to credit access, skill development, marketing support, and specific support for women-owned enterprises in terms of reserving public sector procurement for women-owned enterprises. So basically the point is, in the first 2 sections of this, in domestic drivers, we have spoken about the importance of deregulation. We have spoken about the importance of continuing with various initiatives that we have looked at in the previous surveys in terms of boosting the productive potential. This is all from the policy space. From there, we move on to the role of the private sector, because naturally for a large economy, private sector plays a very big role. And in terms of the private sector, the specific asks are balanced deployment of capital and labor, curbing ultra-processed foods, fairer distribution of incomes, which is related to the balanced deployment of capital and labor, workplace importance to workplace safety, workplace culture and mental health, and thinking about supply and sourcing from a strategic perspective as well, investment in R&D. So these are all the dimensions in which the private sector can also raise the game for the new playing field that we are confronted with today. In terms of fairer distribution of incomes, a topic which we brought up last survey as well, if you look at the growth in profitability and the growth in employment expenses, which is a combination of hiring and compensation, there is a huge disparity between the two, which has been highlighted by several private sector players themselves in the last few months. And this happened even as Indian corporate sector profitability hit a 15-year high in March 2024. And some of you may have heard that when in the 1960s, when Henry Ford raised the minimum wages for his car workers, he said, otherwise there will not be enough people to buy the cars the Ford Motors produces. So in some sense, raising wage and salary growth for workers is also a source for aggregate demand for businesses in the medium run as well. So it is both, it is enlightened self-interest rather than being seen only from a moral prism as well. And in terms of balanced deployment of capital and labor, the clear example is the use of artificial intelligence, and we have a special essay on this topic. In chapter 13, in July 2024, we spoke about the energy demand management in a special essay on dealing with climate change. This time, the special essay is on the impact of artificial intelligence on employment generation and in general on labor. Deployment of artificial intelligence presents both opportunities and challenges. Past technology revolutions in general, sometimes we all feel that technology eventually generates more jobs than it displaces. That is true. But the key word is eventually. What happens between now and eventually is critical. And that is where I think we need to create supporting institutions, enabling institutions to train them, to prepare them, and academic curriculums have to change, workplace practices have to change, etc. So therefore, technological transitions have not been painless in the past, particularly during the previous three industrial revolutions in the Western world, and we need to learn from them, and that is what this chapter covers. And the private sector therefore needs to weigh the benefits of artificial intelligence against the social cost, which may be subterranean in nature and which may surface over a longer period, eventually affecting the environment that is necessary for running businesses smoothly. And therefore, the chapter argues for a careful deployment optimized over a long horizon. This will augment labor and will deliver broad-based social benefits. Of course, one of the considerations, if I may say in a lighter vein, when we wrote this chapter was whether the chapter would become outdated by the time it goes to print, given the kind of fast changes happening in the artificial intelligence space. But the issues that are discussed here is not with respect to the technological developments per se, but also whether the potential and the threat the technology poses for augmenting labor or displacing labor. Those issues are discussed in chapter 13. And where else a private sector can contribute? Compared to several countries, when it comes to R&D spend, 50% of it happens from the government and only 41% happens from business enterprises. Even higher education, academic institutions only contribute 9% compared to other countries. I think this is one area where I think the private sector and people like Mr. Naushad Forbes, etc., have actually written about it. The funding of R&D in India is predominantly from government entities, and it is not for lack of incentives. Specifically, box item 7 in chapter 7 covers the various incentives that the government of India offers in comparison to peer countries, and they are definitely comparable. And R&D in India is primarily driven by business enterprises in many other economies. And whatever R&D happens in the private sector in India is not only low, but is also sectorally concentrated. And that is one area of improvement. Ultra processed foods. It is a 2.5 lakh crore business built on hyper palatability of food items. Misleading advertisements, celebrity endorsements, and missing and obscure labeling on packages targeting consumer behavior. Ultra-processed foods are directly associated with exposure to cancer, respiratory, cardiovascular, and gastrointestinal health outcomes. And poor dietary intake, unfortunately, is also associated with adverse mental health. And most UPF brands target children and adolescents. Therefore, we need to arrive at a quick resolution on the issue pertaining to front of the pack labeling, which has been, happening in fits and starts in this country. And this is not just purely about consumer information and fair disclosure. It has got long-term implications for realizing our demographic dividend and productivity of our youth. Because we initiated the coverage of mental health in a big way in the last survey, and we continue that in this survey as well, and you can find more of it in chapter 11. 4 particular variables have a big implication for mental health. Those who rarely use smartphones, those who are close to their friends and relatives, and those who basically have social connect and physical activity and who consume healthy foods, they have a very high mental score. But if your consumption of ultra processed foods is frequent, and if your family closeness is not much, and nor do you have enough free time for yourself out in the open, and if you rarely exercise, then your mental well-being score is very low. It is not a theoretical construct, it is an empirical finding across the world, including in India. And lower mental health naturally has a direct correlation with the number of working days and overall productivity as well. So in general, workplace culture, private sector's attitude towards ultra-processed foods, prioritizing medium term over short term, all these considerations will eventually determine whether India's wanted demographic dividend actually materializes or not. And I think this is a very important issue. Rather than apart from skilling and education, etc., this is not widely discussed, and we feel this is an important area where private sector can contribute a lot. Energy transition the Indian way, which is the topic in the chapter on climate change and adaptation. A well-known French economist, John Pisani-Ferry, in the context of Europe, wrote that there is an impossible trinity of net zero. That is, policy cannot be at the same time fiscally sustainable and the economy is competitive without giving up on net zero ambitions. And that is what we call it, the impossible trinity of net zero. On the right side, between fiscal sustainability, net zero goals, and competitiveness of the economy at any given point in time, only two are possible. If you want to pursue net zero and be competitive also in the global economic space, then there has to be a lot of subsidization that has to happen. If you want to be fiscally sustainable, on the other hand, and also be economically competitive, Europe is realizing that net zero goals will become that much more challenging to pursue. Again, the Mario Draghi report on competitiveness has a lot to say on this with respect to Europe, and it applies to developing countries like ours as well. At the same time, if you want to pursue net zero, at the same time be fiscally prudent, then competitiveness will take a big hit as well, because energy costs will go up significantly, as has happened in Europe between pre-COVID and post-COVID. So the net result is that the trade-offs in climate mitigation is such that these days countries are realizing that we need to spend a lot of effort and resources on adaptation. The theme of the chapter on climate this time is how do we maximize our adaptation efforts, adaptation funding, as opposed to focusing on emission mitigation. India's energy transition, therefore, needs to have a multifaceted approach. It cannot be only about renewable energy, and renewable should be expanded to include transition fuels like natural gas and also, more importantly, nuclear power as well. And coal will continue to remain the mainstay, even as we are making far better progress than many other countries on nationally determined contributions. In fact, India's use of coal has not come in the way of India making much better progress on NDCs compared to Western nations. These considerations are discussed in great detail in the chapter on climate and also in chapter 5 as well. In terms of financing, much of the flows today are concentrated on emission mitigation, but critically important given the fact that the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will anyway cause global warming and damage to countries' environment. Countries need to generate more adaptation financing. In fact, the Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling very clearly said, if per capita income growth in the next 40 years compares with the 40 years just before that, vulnerability to climate change should diminish and the resources available for adaptation should be greater. I say this not to minimize concern about climate change, but to anticipate whether developing countries should make sacrifices in their development to minimize the emission of gases that may change the climate to their disadvantage. Their best defense against climate change may be their own continued development. Basically, the point is, economic growth and development generates the resources to be able to deal with energy transition and climate change. And therefore, if we have to continue to grow while making energy transition, prioritization should be on adaptation. And apart from the strategic considerations I mentioned earlier in terms of ensuring that we are not affected by the single source concentration risk that many countries, including India, are exposed to. And as we wrote in the last economic survey in chapter 13, the power of collective action, small changes, big impact, has to be also kept in mind. The lifestyle for environment movement, small individual actions, impact of lifestyle changes. A 13% change in global population behavior can reduce carbon emissions. For example, having the thermostat at 26 degrees or 27 degrees and having a small fan circulation will keep the room cool than keeping the thermostat at 20 degrees in summer, for example. Food waste reduction. Finishing food on a plate can save 90 kilograms of food waste per person annually, cutting down carbon emission and food loss. Carpooling and public transportation, which I alluded to earlier, can cut down transport sector emissions. Carpooling can save 380 million liters of fuel daily in India by reducing nearly 8 lakh rides per day. And public transportation in terms of integrated solutions is much better than focusing on tailpipe emissions through e-mobility, which also has a strategic angle to it. Recycling power. Recycling 1 ton of newspaper can prevent 25,000 liters of water wastage, contributing to more efficient resource use. Finally, we come to the state of the economy, which is the current. The economy grew 6% in the first half, and second half, it is poised to do better. Growth remains close to decadal averages, especially if you look at agricultural sector, gross value added, industry, they all have grown better than the average over the entire period between FY15 and FY24 in FY25. Services sector is almost there, but overall the point is that the pandemic effects have completely now been erased from the trend growth estimates. And you can see that in the different components of expenditure-based GDP, gross fixed capital formation has improved from 28.2% to more than 30%. And consumption share, private consumption share has gone up from 58.7% to 61.8%. And government expenditure has come down, in fact, from 10.8 to 10.3% compared to FY18. And export share also has gone up from 18.8 in FY18 to an estimated 21.5% in FY25. So basically, compared to the pre-pandemic shares of GDP, there is a good contribution or a better contribution coming from exports and gross fixed capital formation and private consumption as well. And this is what I mentioned in the previous slide. If you look at the overall GVA on the top left, it has caught up with the trend growth, pre-pandemic trend. Agriculture has been above pre-pandemic trend, partly because of the growth in allied services, which I showed you earlier, which is a high single-digit growth rates. And industry has now just popped its head above the pre-pandemic trend, bottom left. And with respect to the overall services sector, again, we have caught up with the pre-pandemic trend as well. Inflationary pressures have come down, barring a few items. If you look at the left side, you see the core inflation, core food, consumer food price index, overall core inflation, and the CPI inflation. Core inflation is below 4%. Overall inflation is 5.2%, and the food price inflation index is close to about 8%. But if you remove specific items, then you can see that overall inflation trends are very subdued, and that is what the right side chart confirms for us. Headline inflation is 5%, but excluding tomatoes, onions, and potatoes is about 4%. Excluding pulse and vegetables is below 4% as well. In terms of export growth, while the headline numbers in merchandise exports may appear subdued, if you strip out petroleum and gems and jewelry, the growth is close to 10% between FY24 and FY25 in the first 8 months of the current financial year. And services sector in general have continued to grow in terms of the surpluses, and in the first half of the first 9 months of April to December 2023 and 2024, there has been a bigger surplus on the services trade as well. Naturally, all of this resulting in a balance of payments, which is very comfortable. Around 1% of GDP is the current account deficit. And therefore, financing this current account deficit has been not a problem, despite successful and profitable exits by many businesses in the last 2 years. Even as the gross inflows are improving, the repatriations on account of profitable exits or transfer of ownership from direct to portfolio investors hasn't posed a problem for the current account because of the subdued oil prices, strong private transfers, and good export performance in the services sector, contributing to a current account deficit which is just around 1% of GDP. The growth outlook for FY26, we projected 6.5% to 7% for FY25, and this time we are projecting a growth outlook between 6.3 and 6.8% for FY26, which is in line with the projections made by many international organizations as well. The risk factor, of course, again, not only because of the changes in the global playing field, Global stock markets also have become lately volatile, as we witnessed earlier this week. And we have an interesting box item in chapter 2 looking at the correlation between S&P 500 and the Nifty indices. Whenever in the last 24 years since the millennium began, whenever the S&P 500 corrected, what was the impact on Indian stocks and vice versa. So that is a factor that we need to keep in mind, because the massive growth in retail participation in the Indian stock market is definitely a good thing. But also, when the market corrects, it could have implications for spending intentions, and sentiment effect, etc., could be significant. And that is one risk we have kept in mind when we came up with the outlook between 6.3 and 6.8% for the real GDP growth. And as we always say, we will be very happy to be proven to be wrong and conservative if the final outcome turns out to be better than 6.8 as well. So to sum up, how do we raise our game for a new playing field when globalization is no longer going to provide the tailwind in terms of export growth and foreign investment growth? We need to deregulate to make it easier for small and medium enterprises to grow. Deregulation is about removing the fear of growth in micro, medium, and small enterprises. And this is about the plumbing and the nuts and bolts of deregulation, which are primarily there in the state and local government space. We have to continue to augment internal capacities for growth. Particularly, agriculture sector has a potential to contribute up to 1% to GDP growth. Private sector can do its part in terms of lifting the spending on R&D, in terms of striking a better balance between capital and labor share in their businesses, in terms of marketing of ultra processed foods, and taking mental health seriously as well. With respect to energy transition, considerations of financing, considerations of supply chain concentration risk, etc., means that we need to focus on public transportation and adaptation as an important strategy rather than emission mitigation, in relatively speaking. Business as usual across all sectors, academia, private sector, governments, etc., business as usual carries the risk of growth stagnation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. Now, floor is open for the questions. So, starting with 127. Please introduce yourself and your organization's name, and then mic at 127.
Hi, sir. Good evening. Hi, sir. Good evening. Ruchi Bhatia. This is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. Your economic survey, sir, did make a case for deregulation and asking states to really get out of the way so that businesses can do better. I just want to understand from you, what can the federal government really do to nudge or prod states to get out of the way, to be able to deregulate in a more extensive way?
I think more than the federal government nudging them, the successes of states that have done deregulation more than others, which is what the chart on the progress in Business Reform Action Plan, BRAP, and level of industrial activity, that should in and of itself be a sufficient motivation.
4.
So Timsi Jaipuria, this side from CNBC TV 18. Sir, your survey did mention about employment. It also warned about AI taking away a lot of roles, but also said that employment at the level when it comes to the private sector, a lot of working hours need to be managed. At factory level also, working hours need to be regulated. There should be a flexible working hours to be given to the employees. What is it that the government has in its mind for the private sector on employment, be it generation of employment, be it the working hours, or as you made a case for salaries, wages to be enhanced? You gave a very clear example of Force Motor saying that if salaries increase, only then people can buy the cars that Force Motors is manufacturing. So given all of this, what is your view or what government can do on the employment side?
Again, what the government can do was already demonstrated in the July budget of last year, when the government announced multiple schemes to incentivize labor augmentation in businesses, both in manufacturing, non-manufacturing, new jobs, adding to existing payrolls, etc., by defraying some of the contributions to EPFO, announcing the corporate internship scheme. So what the government can or should do was extensively mentioned, and even policy actions taken in the last budget of July 2024. And of course, the government can continue to take policy actions as it has been doing with respect to PLI schemes on labor-intensive sectors. And also in terms of the deregulation action, that is the government's, not just the union government, but the state governments and local governments' contribution to employment generation, is by reducing the fixed cost of doing business so that firms can raise the variable cost by hiring more people. Beyond that, I think not everything needs a policy tweak or a policy intervention. Some of it is in the natural self-interest of businesses to be able to find this balance. And that is why I gave the example of Mr. Henry Ford. I'll just ask my colleague Anuradha, do you have anything to add? No.
Two.
Dr. Nageswaran Karishma this side from Business Today. The previous economic survey had mentioned about the China Plus One strategy and how India could draw dual benefit out of it. But this one does not explicitly mention it. Does this indicate a change of stance of the government, or the strategy is still a part of it?
There is nothing. This time we are speaking about the importance of importance to be given to domestic growth drivers, building domestic supply chain resilience, which is the same as what has been the thought process behind the Atmanirbhar Bharata, China Plus One, etc. So